Neville Goddard, and the idea expressed in the title can be stated with precision. He held that the repeated occupation of a single inner feeling state functions within consciousness as a primary condition from which experience is later organized and interpreted. In his view, what is decisive is not a momentary thought or an emotional surge, but the stabilization of an assumption about oneself. A feeling, once accepted and returned to again and again, becomes a reference point for identity. From that reference point, perception, expectation, and interpretation are arranged. The claim is not that repetition produces external events by force, but that it establishes the psychological ground upon which events are recognized as fitting, possible, or coherent. The central question raised by this claim is whether such repetition merely fixes an interpretive frame, or whether it can be treated as causally prior to what later appears as fact. For this model to function, a specific assumption about consciousness must already be in place. Goddard treats awareness not as a secondary product of conditions, but as the field in which conditions are disclosed and structured. In this framework, experience is not first given and then understood. It is always already shaped by the standpoint from which it is apprehended. You are asked to consider consciousness as the first condition of meaning, not its after effect. A feeling that is accepted as true of self is not a private mood, but a structural feature of this field. It determines what is noticed, what is dismissed, and what is taken as consistent. The unresolved philosophical issue is whether consciousness can coherently be described as generative in this way, or whether it remains only a system of representation that reflects a world already formed. Within this assumption, Goddard's use of the word feeling refers to a stable cognitive affective orientation rather than to a transient emotion. A feeling is the background sense of what one is, what one can expect, and what one can reasonably take for granted. You can observe that such orientations operate continuously, often without explicit attention. They organize anticipation, shape self-evaluation, and guide interpretation. In this model, repetition serves to make a particular orientation habitual. The mind, through return and familiarity, comes to treat it as normal. The question that remains open is whether this stabilization changes only the interpretation of events or also the range of possibilities that are experienced as accessible. Because of this, repetition holds a central place in Goddard's system. A single act of imagining or a brief acceptance of an idea does not by itself alter the underlying cognitive set. Competing self-descriptions and expectations continue to operate. Repetition functions as reinforcement. It gradually displaces alternative assumptions by making one state more familiar, more readily available, and less internally contradicted. The mind tends to accept as real what it encounters most consistently within itself. Familiarity becomes a criterion of plausibility. The unresolved tension here is whether such familiarity should be equated with truth in any objective sense, or whether it only establishes subjective coherence. The internal logic that follows from this is circular but structured and assumed. State shapes perception. Perception then supplies instances that appear to confirm the state. This confirmation stabilizes identity, which in turn strengthens the assumption. The system is self-reinforcing. Goddard does not treat this circularity as a defect. He treats it as the operating principle of consciousness. The mind, in this view, cannot step outside its own organizing conditions. It can only reorganize them. The philosophical question is whether such loops merely validate themselves or whether they can be said to participate in the formation of what is experienced as an external order. This way of locating priority in inner orientation has a long historical background. In Stoic thought, the quality of experience is said to depend on judgment rather than on events themselves. In Platonic and later idealist traditions, Forms of understanding are treated as conditions under which phenomena become intelligible. In modern cognitive psychology, expectancy and schema are recognized as shaping perception and memory. Goddard's language differs from these traditions, but the structure is similar. In each case, belief or assumption is not a passive reaction, but an organizing principle. The continuity of this pattern raises a further question. Does its recurrence indicate a genuine insight into the structure of experience, or does it simply reveal a persistent human tendency to locate order in meaning rather than in mechanism? From this perspective, perception is never neutral. It is filtered through what is already taken to be the case. You can notice that attention is drawn toward what fits expectation and away from what does not. In Goddard's framework, a repeated feeling state functions as such an expectation at the level of identity. It sorts what is noticed, how it is interpreted, and what is remembered. Experience is not first given and then organized. It is organized in the act of being experienced. The remaining issue is whether any perception can be separated from these pre-structuring conditions, or whether all experience is inevitably shaped by them. Agency, within this model, is therefore redefined. It is not primarily the capacity to manipulate circumstances, but the capacity to consent to and sustain a particular inner position. You are not described as controlling events directly, but as selecting the standpoint from which events acquire meaning and continuity. Action follows from orientation. Responsibility is located in the acceptance of a state as one's own. The unresolved tension is whether this preserves a robust notion of agency or whether it transforms responsibility into a form of alignment with whatever. Orientation becomes dominant. At the center of this structure stands identity, expressed in Goddard's repeated emphasis on the implicit sense of I am. Repetition does not merely reinforce a thought. It stabilizes a mode of being. What is felt again and again becomes incorporated into the working definition of self. This self-model then determines which assumptions can be held without strain and which appear implausible. The philosophical question is whether identity is sufficiently fluid to be reorganized in this way, or whether it is constrained by developmental, biological, and social factors that limit the range of possible reconfigurations. The state that indicates the completion of this process, in Goddard's description, is not emotional intensity, but cognitive stillness. When a feeling state no longer generates internal argument, when it is no longer contrasted with alternatives, it has become integrated. The mind no longer treats it as a possibility, but as a given. This stillness is not an instruction or a goal. It is a descriptive marker of stability. It signifies that an assumption has become the background condition of awareness rather than an object within it. Taken together, Neville Goddard's framework forms a coherent inner model. Repeated feeling establishes assumption. Assumption organizes perception. Perception reinforces identity. Attention sustains the cycle. Certainty, in this context, is not emotional conviction, but the absence of internal contradiction. Imagination is the capacity to occupy a cognitive position. Discipline is the capacity to remain there, whether or not one accepts the causal claims implied by this structure. Its internal logic can be traced without appeal to persuasion or belief. It describes a way of understanding how consciousness might organize experience through stabilized inner states, and how repetition, identity, and perception are proposed to form a closed, self-consistent system.